Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. We are the Permafrost community of practice, but I know there are other communities of practice in attendance today from IARPIC. And so thanks for coming, and we welcome all of you. So the Permafrost community of practice, our main objectives are to advance understanding of processes controlling permafrost dynamics and the impacts of ecosystems, infrastructure, and climate feedbacks. And we have a couple of the Permafrost community of practice leads on the call today. I'm one of them. I'm a federal co-lead. I work for the National Park Service Arctic Inventory and Monitoring Program. And I have a background in permafrost and carbon dynamics. And I'll let Ava Stefani introduce herself.
Thanks, John. Yes, Eva Stefani. I'm based at USGS, the Alaska Science Center, and I look mainly at permafrost terrain dynamics with a focus on ground ice. And I believe Kyle is also on the call.
Yeah, thanks, Ava. I'm Kyle Arndt. I'm a research scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, and my research focus is on greenhouse gas fluxes from permafrost regions, primarily using eddy covariance.
Yeah, and the other two leads are Ben Jones at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and Lauren Boldrick at the EPA. So I guess with that, I will share my screen. Okay, are we all good?
Yes, yeah, it looks good.
Okay, so yeah, today I'll be talking about rusting rivers in Alaska's Brooks Range. This here is an aerial picture from Kenton Hill of the Kutuk River, which is draining into the Alatna in Gates of the Arctic National Park. And so this talk is part of a broader area of research that our group has been working on the last couple of years about emerging environmental toxicity from permafrost thaw in the Arctic. And so we have two main regions that of focus that we're interested in. One is rusting rivers, and the other is soil inundation and hotspots of methylmercury production, and how permafrost mercury might be getting into aquatic food webs. But today, I'll primarily be focusing on rusting rivers, and in particular, the paper that was published in May of this year in the Nature Journal Communications, Earth and Environment, and it's titled "Metal Mobilization from Thawing Permafrost to Aquatic Ecosystems is Driving Rusting of Arctic Rivers." And just wanted to acknowledge all the co-authors on this paper. This is definitely a collaborative effort. And if you haven't seen this, we worked with the University of California, Davis to put together a YouTube video. It's about 5 or 6 minutes, and they did a really nice job at taking some imagery and interviews and splicing together the story for us. And so just to give a little bit of background, our initial observations of rusting rivers go back about 6 years now. So we, as part of a joint project with the U.S. Geological Survey, we were monitoring streams in Arctic national parks. One of them was in the Akillik River drainage in Kobuk Valley National Park. And so we had been sampling this river and instrumented it. This is a picture from summer of 2017. When we went back for a site visit in 2018, this stream had changed color from this pristine clear water system on the left to this stained orange system on the right. And it was very abrupt. I guess at the time when we saw that change, I thought it was somewhat anomalous, and we collected all the samples and we thought, this could be an interesting story. But I wasn't aware of too many of these type of situations in the region where we were working. When we went out in 2019, we were flying over the Agashashok River in the lower Noatak River Basin, and we noticed this stretch of the Aggie, as we call it, where there had been this seep, point source, where if you can see my mouse here, this is the river's flowing this downstream direction. So we have this clear, pristine water above the seep, and then as soon as you hit this turn in the river, everything turned this dark stained orange, and it persisted for several miles downstream. And when we went and landed at that seep, this is a picture from 2022, we were flying over it, and you can see that it kind of looks like a fire scar, like a tundra burn. But when we landed on it, we noticed that this wasn't fire, this wasn't charcoal, this was just dead vegetation, most likely from the toxic metals and acid that were emerging from the seep. And so after seeing a couple of these observations in the region, we started to compile observations. We crowdsourced observations from other people who are working in the national parks and the fish and wildlife refuges in the region. We got information from pilots who know these watersheds better than most of us, and other people living in villages and nearby communities. And for the paper, we ended up compiling all these into a map of more than 75 streams that had changed from clear to orange. And these streams span a broad spatial extent of the Brooks Range in northern Alaska, greater than 1,000 kilometers from west to east, from the lower Noatak in the west to the Arctic refuge in the east. And review of satellite imagery indicates that most of these streams have changed color in the last decade. There's some that have been orange for longer than that, but in general, most have changed somewhat recently. For a couple of these streams, we did a remote sensing analysis that used USGS Landsat time series data, and we calculated a redness index to reflect the presence of iron oxides in streams. And this has been done in other systems around the world. And we did this for stream reaches where we knew that there had been a color change, including the Agashashok and Noatak National Preserve, the Kugurorok River, and Anaktok Creek, which is a tributary of the Salmon Wild and Scenic River in Kobuk Valley National Park. And these plots on the right are redness index over time. And so when you see values that are less than 1.5 on the redness index, that indicates a clear water system, and those show up as gray dots. We identified a threshold greater than 1.5 as being a stream that had changed color. And so you can see for the Agashashok River, everything on that reach of stream was below 1.5 up until about 2018. And at that point, the stream changed color and the redness index rose above 1.5, and you can see those as the orange dots here. Similar findings on the Kugurorok River, which is in the middle river of the Noatak. And so basically everything was clear up until about 2018, 2017. And now we have a number of tributaries that have changed orange. The Anaktok Creek of the Salmon had a couple periods in its past during the period of record that we have of the Landsat imagery where the redness index exceeded 1.5 and it would recover. And then it exceeded 1.5 and then it would recover. And in the last couple of years, it stayed more orange. So there's some interesting things to tease apart from those observations. At a number of sites, we collected discrete water samples and took measurements of the geochemistry and compared the chemistry of the rusting impaired reaches, which are here in orange, and the clear water unimpaired reaches. And so what this figure here shows is that while it's not a huge difference in the main stem of these rivers, we do see slightly lower pH, so more acidic in the resting rivers compared to the clear streams. We also see an increase in sulfate concentration. And we also see an increase in the sum of metals. These red dots also indicate seeps. These are data from seeps, so you can see the pH of the seep compared to the stream is much lower. So we're looking at a pH of around 2.5 at the seep. Up here, we're seeing sulfate concentrations upwards of 10,000 milligrams per liter and very high concentrations of trace metals. This pie chart shows the dominance of these major metals. Obviously, the orange coloration is due to the presence of oxidized iron, but there's also a fair amount of aluminum and manganese, and then a range of different trace metals. And so you can see for not just aluminum, manganese, and iron, but for all these trace metals like cobalt, nickel, copper, zinc, arsenic, cadmium, and lead, in general, we see higher concentrations of these metals in streams that are orange compared to those that are clear. So this increase in metal concentrations has lots of implications. One of them is for aquatic life in the stream. So we, in that stream back in the Aquilic River Basin in Kobuk Valley, we had collected samples of resident fish and macroinvertebrate community and measured periphyton, or the algae biofilm growing on the rocks of the stream, both before and after this color change. And so prior to the color change, there was a very healthy population of juvenile Dolly Varden and slimy sculpin. But after the stream changed color, there was a complete loss of fish. So loss of Dolly Varden, loss of slimy sculpin. Similarly, we had a very healthy benthic macroinvertebrate community in the Clearwater stream, and that density of macroinvertebrates declined dramatically after the color change. And then finally, there was a healthy periphyton biomass on the bed of these streams prior to color change, but afterwards we see that these streams become blanketed with the iron oxide deposits, and so we see a decline in green algae and cyanobacteria and a loss of diatoms as a result. And so this is important because it represents a degradation of habitat quality for the biota in the system. So permafrost thaw as a driver of rusting rivers. I guess that is a question, and I feel like we have some evidence to support that. First is the timing of the color change, the fact that this region has undergone rapid warming over the last several decades, and that this is largely in a region of continuous permafrost, but there's been evidence in the literature that this relatively cold permafrost is warming and thawing, and that there's been a step change. It was reported by Swanson et al. Over the last decade in terms of warming and thaw. The spatial extent of this. So most of these sites where things are happening are on protected lands. There's not a lot of mining activity or other land use effects. So it's happening in remote wilderness and not as a result of anthropogenic direct land use or anthropogenic disturbance. There are some prior studies linking thaw and weathering processes, such as what we're seeing here, work by Scott Zolkos and Ryan Toohey. And then there's work that we often refer to done by Santosh Panda and those in the Geophysical Institute at UAF, showing that permafrost in these Arctic national parks is likely to be warming in the coming decades. And so this here is a schematic diagram. We worked with Julia Ditto, who's an amazing graphic artist who helped us pull all of these observations into a really attractive conceptual diagram. And so here, this image on the left shows what the hydrology and the the strata, a cross-sectional view of a hill slope in an Arctic watershed. And what we think happens here is that groundwater is routed through shallow horizons through the active layer, and deeper groundwater may penetrate through fractured bedrock, but there is and anything like this pyrite here is largely in a frozen state and not reactive with respect to chemical weathering. But as permafrost thaws, either active layer thickens or thermokarst happens, we get pyrite that can be exposed to groundwater and oxygen, and that can result in the mobilization of acid and sulfate and a range of different trace metals, depending on the specific lithology, that can then transport iron and metals into the stream where it can be oxidized and create this orange color. Oops. Okay. So there are other, so basically what we think is that a lot of these observations, both the chemistry and our understanding of permafrost in the region, is evidence of sulfide oxidation. And there are a number of other papers that point towards this process in the Arctic with respect to permafrost thaw. And then there's this recent paper here by Kameni et al. Showing that Arctic permafrost thawing is enhancing sulfide oxidation. And then this earlier paper by Zolkos et al., where they talk about sulfide oxidation and a number of other weathering processes and how that links to the permafrost carbon feedback. But it's not just permafrost where these sort of things are happening. It can also be in other components of the cryosphere. So both in glaciers and in alpine catchments out of the northern permafrost region, but they could be in where there is mountain permafrost or rock glaciers. In the paper, we also talk about another process that is not a chemical weathering process. It is more of a microbially mediated process. So in this case, when permafrost thaws, soils can get wetter, and that changes the redox state of the soils. And under these conditions, iron can be reduced to highly mobile dissolved iron 2, which can be transported by groundwater to stream. So so there can be both a physical chemical weathering mode for rusting rivers, but also a microbially mediated mechanism. The difference here is that in places where this microbial process is occurring, that we're less likely to see really high concentrations of trace metals like copper and zinc. But this mechanism has been explored by other researchers like Amanda Barker on the North Slope and Patzner et al. In Europe. So we have a lot of potential impacts to aquatic food webs. There's the direct uptake of trace metals by fish from the water column that can impact their gills and get into their tissues. And then also there could be bioaccumulation of toxic metals in an organism over time, so accumulating up through the base of the food web. And then also ecosystem contraction, or the loss of habitat due to these degraded conditions. There are also implications for humans, particularly drinking water. We are actively working on analyzing our data from the last couple of years to determine whether the concentrations of metals that we're observing exceed those allowable by the EPA. We know that at the concentrations we have observed, there definitely could be an effect on the taste of the water, and in areas where there's lots of particulates, we would definitely recommend filtering your water if you're out and about and you don't have any other choice but to drink from these systems. It can also have an impact on subsistence fishing through the accumulation of toxins in fish species, the loss of habitat, or impacts directly on anadromous fish and their spawning grounds. So I just wanted to highlight a couple areas where we have ongoing research and where future research is headed on this topic. First, we're really interested in rusting river toxicity to aquatic biota. This is work being conducted by Taylor Evinger, who is a PhD candidate at University of California, Davis. And she's using the biotic ligand model, which has a couple components. But the main thing to know about this is that we're taking all these stream chemistry observations. So your base cations like calcium, magnesium, and sodium and potassium, and the metal concentrations, and then potential ways that these metals might be binding with other things like DOC, dissolved organic carbon, or dissolved inorganic carbon. And ultimately, we want to model the speciation of the metal. So the metals of concern are often in this free metal state, but if they're bound up with carbon, then the organisms are less vulnerable to the effects of these metals. And the model will provide an estimate of acute toxicity. So the lethal concentration where 50% of the organisms would die, and then specific criteria for certain analytes like copper. And so Taylor is working on that right now, and as one of her dissertation chapters, and we look forward to her sharing more of that information soon. We also have a new postdoc, Becca Fry, who is joining us on a 3-year fellowship funded by the National Park Foundation. And her postdoctoral proposal is titled "The Resilience and Vulnerability of Arctic River Ecosystems to Permafrost Thaw and Emergent Acid Rock Drainage." And so she is going to be focused on geospatial analyses and also looking at other ecosystem processes that might be being altered by these rusting rivers, including carbon and nutrient cycling. We also have some new funding to look at the permafrost within these seeps, where these metal seeps are emerging out of rocks and hillsides. And so this is led by Dr. Josh Cook from the USGS, and it's funded by the USGS Changing Arctic Ecosystems Initiative. And the plan is to go out in the coming years to these seeps. Here you can see a picture of one in the Kelly River Basin and the Noatak, and do some geophysical investigations to better understand the architecture of the permafrost. Is this ground ice? Is this talc, represent open talc formation? What is happening with the hydrology, and why are they emerging in these specific locations? And then finally, we are interested in environmental DNA in rusting rivers. So one of the issues when you're trying to collect biological samples from these rusting rivers is that often the water is opaque, very turbid, and a lot of the methods that we would typically use to collect fish, like backpack electrofishing, are not very efficient. And so one of the ways you could do that is taking samples of the water for free-floating eDNA that will help us get at the presence or absence of different species in these impaired systems. And so I'd just like to thank everybody for listening. Definitely, if you have any questions, let me know. I wanted to acknowledge all the funding that we have for this work, and co-authors and collaborators, and particularly Ken Hill at the Park Service. So Ken has been an essential partner for us in terms of combing through the remote sensing data, but also we get a lot of contacts with people who have made observations of rusting rivers. And so Ken has been receiving those observations and compiling them in a database that is stored by the National Park Service. And so he's been updating that on a regular basis as we receive more and more observations. And yeah, just wanted to thank Ken for that. So with that, I think I'll stop sharing and take any questions. I see Ava.
Yes, thanks, John. I was wondering, you showed that in those first slides, there was the recovery of the red index in some of the streams. Have you had time or I guess interest to look at the recovery of some of those habitat ecosystem or?
Yeah, I think I think it is complex. We don't understand all the drivers as to why a stream would turn orange and then go back to clear. But I guess what I'd say we know about the permafrost and the hydrology in these systems is that permafrost can recover with a cold winter or a low snow year. And so if that recovery of permafrost were to reroute groundwater away from where these mineral deposits are, like pyrite, then we would suspect that the stream would change from orange back to clear. And so that's happened at a couple streams where we've been working in the last couple years. I'd say the general trend is that there's more and more orange streams, but the ones that have recovered, we've gone in and we've sampled for fish and we've sampled for bugs. And there does appear to be some recovery of the aquatic life. And so the other thing that we're aware of is that just because a stream isn't, so iron is much less toxic. It has to be present at really high concentrations to have a toxic effect, whereas some of these metals, these other metals, can be present at much lower concentrations to convey toxic effects on a fish. And so one of the things we're interested in is streams that may not necessarily be orange, but still have really high concentrations of trace metals, and thinking about not just acute effects over like really short-term bursts of high concentrations and exposures to fish, but more chronic effects that might be sublethal or may affect their growth or reproduction, things like that.
Thanks.
John, we have a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is from Tobias and at IARC at UAF, and he's asking, sorry, Tobias, are there any potential management responses being discussed ranging from chemical to mechanical drainage management interventions that could help mediate impacts on aquatic life, similar to perhaps what you would be seeing with mining?
Yeah, I think we need to be thinking about that. I think most of the mitigations are going to be not, because these orange reaches are happening in such remote wilderness areas, mostly away from where humans are. There's very little we could do at the watershed scale to mitigate or help with ecological recovery. It's different than mining, where you have a direct point source effect or a direct fingerprint on the landscape, where you could do something about it at a relatively small scale. These are happening at very broad scales, and I'm afraid there's not a ton we can do. I think we need to keep working on it to understand the seasonality and the interannual variability of these systems to see what extent they could recover. I think a lot of the management, at least from like the Park Services side of things, will likely be about education and communication and sharing the location of where these are happening. So like the Salmon River is a national wild and scenic river, and so it's been designated and protected by the National Park Service, and it is right upstream of the village of Kayana. And so that is a spot where there's concern because it's much closer to where people live. It's closer to where people conduct subsistence activities, and there needs to be more communication and management response, I think, on that side of things. But yeah, there's not an easy answer to how to deal with it.
We have a question from Christina in the chat. Do you think that there are detectable changes at the river mouth and therefore impacts to coastal ocean estuaries, or is the change diluted out through the rest of the watershed?
Yeah, it's a really good question. One of the goals of this project is to quantify the persistence of these chemical effects as you move further and further downstream away from a seep. And so this summer we floated a river in the Noatak, and we took a bunch of measurements synoptically as we went downstream, like starting above a seep, past the seep, and then far downstream from the seep. And so I think what we saw there is that a lot of these effects persisted for quite a while. We don't have all the chemistry data, but we used like a sensor to look at conductivity and pH as we went. I think we'll have more information on that sooner than later. I think we're also interested in how iron released into these systems could not just function as something that degrades ecosystems, but something that actually promotes productivity of estuarine and nearshore coastal marine ecosystems, as iron tends to be one of the limiting nutrients for marine productivity. And so that's something we're aware of. And one of the things that requires is doing a better job on measuring and estimating the flux, not just the concentration of the metals, but the flux from these watersheds to the coasts. And so we're working with hydrologists at USGS to do a better job at that.
Okay, and just like anyone who's asking a question in the chat, if you want to respond verbally, you can always come off mute as well. And then we have another question from Kevin Fraley regarding the mitigation of these seeps. I believe Red Dog Mine, I guess this is a comment. I believe Red Dog Mine has had success with blocking them off and preventing them from seeping into the Woolwich River.
Yeah, there's definitely some of these issues happening in the region of Red Dog Mine and upstream of the mine too. I know there's like thermokarst up in the basin there, and Chelsea Clausen from Alaska Department of Fish and Game is somebody who's been working in that region. Yeah, I'm not too familiar with Red Dog's mitigation approaches, but I'd be interested in learning more about that.
Sure, Ava, go ahead.
Yeah. you mentioned earlier, like there's still a lot of work to do for like figuring out the drivers of all those seepage. Has this been a little bit of like looking at extreme in temperature or precipitation to kind of see if there's a timing in those, or that hasn't been looked into it yet?
Yeah, that has not, I mean, so I guess I would say that there has not been any statistical analysis of climate that has been able to point directly at this is the thing that's driving it. It's more sort of general warming, but not, yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity for people to jump in and explore what are the drivers, like in terms of climate, precip, snow, and then what's happening in the subsurface. I think there's a lot of room for understanding these mechanisms. And, I think in the places where there are seeps, there appears to be more abrupt permafrost thaw. So things that resemble thermokarst, or some potentially like an open talc where you have emergence of groundwater flowing up vertically through a thawed layer. There's also potential that there is simply active layer thickening in places where it's not a point source. And while active layer thickening is a less dramatic shift in or mode of permafrost thaw, in a lot of these soils, we believe there could be sort of these micro framboidal pyrite, which, an increase in active layer thickness of 20-30 centimeters could actually expose a lot more pyrite to oxidation and subsequent mobilization of metals into the stream. So yeah, these are all really active areas of research that need to be pursued.
And was it like you showed a photo, one of the first stream and you saw it in August 17 and it was pristine water, and then in August 2019 it was red. Has it been mainly in late summer with the maximum thaw, or that's also just happened to be when you were there?
That happened to be when we were there. We've seen pretty much everything. Like we've seen it be bright orange at snowmelt. You would think there'd be more of like a dilution effect from snowmelt, but we've seen a lot of streams where it's bright orange at high flows. So it's not just during a period of maximum thaw when it can happen, which makes me think that there's zones of preferential flow where, like I mentioned with the talc, or yeah, deeper thermokarst that have allowed for these mineral deposits and groundwater to come to the surface.
Thanks.
Yeah, Christina.
Hi, John. I'm also curious, this can't just be happening in the Alaskan Arctic, right? Like this has to be happening in other nations as well. Any info on that?
Yeah, so we know that the process of sulfide oxidation is happening in response to thaw. And so there's definitely people working on that in Western Canada, in the Yukon Territory, Northwest Territories, in the Mackenzie River Basin. There is most of the work that I'm aware of is focused on linkages to the carbon cycle, and how weathering processes like sulfide oxidation can impact CO2 sources and sinks at the watershed or regional scale, and how that relates to the permafrost carbon feedback to the climate. There is less work, and there's some extent, there is some work focused on geochemistry for sure in aquatic ecosystems. There's less work focused on aquatic life. There is a number of places where this is happening, not just at high latitudes. As I mentioned, there's places in the Pyrenees, in the European Alps, and in Peru, in the Andes, where you have glacial melt or mountain permafrost that is melting or thawing, and you're seeing this acid rock drainage, orange seeps appearing as a result of ice loss. So it's happening everywhere. I think we're also getting observations from other parts of Alaska. So Wrangell St. Elias National Park, Denali in the Alaska Range. I think it's something that is happening in settings where you have the right combination of geology, the lithology of these rocks, and permafrost and groundwater interacting. And so I think some of our work is trying to get at this geospatial analysis that has to be done to say which rivers are vulnerable to this sort of occurrence. What are the drivers, and how can we use both remotely sensed data and field observations and models to understand, when and where is this happening?
Super interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your questions. Yeah, well, yeah, thanks everybody for your questions, and thanks for coming today.
Yep. Yes. Yeah, we've got more time, so if there are more questions, please feel free to ask them. Any type of question I think is valuable. And while people are thinking about that, I'll just let people know of a couple of upcoming meetings from the Permafrost Community of Practice and others that would probably or might be of interest. There is a terrestrial ecosystems team meeting coming up on September 19th, where they're introducing Indigenous fellows, and one of those Indigenous fellows, Caitlin, is presenting on her work on river rusting in the Woolwich River Basin. So that there might be some nice connections there. There's a October 1st, the Denali Commission is launching their gathering input for the next Alaska statewide environmental threat assessment. And so that meeting will happen where they'll be introducing their process for that and starting to gather feedback on how the statewide environmental threat assessment should be updated. The Permafrost team is hosting a shallow groundwater resources and permafrost meeting on October 8th. And then on November 12th, there's a natural methane emissions meeting, topic meeting from the permafrost community as well. Any more questions? Oh, we've got, yes, the date for the Woolwich River presentation is on September 19th, and I'll put a link to that in the chat. That meeting. Any other questions? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, this meeting was recorded and will be posted probably on Thursday. So if you know of someone who was not able to attend but was interested, feel free to share the link with them. And thanks, Jon, for putting this together.
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. And yeah, thanks, everybody.